They say that it's much more difficult to give a second TEDx speech than the first one. Anyway, I wanted to start by talking about, they say that people like me who have visited many conflict zones, it's very, very difficult actually to talk about it. A big reason is that perhaps we've been confronted with the worst aspects of humanity. Well, I visited my first conflict zone shortly after 9/11, 2001. And it was in between the countries of Tajikistan and Afghanistan, a barren, windswept plain that was home to about 15,000 internally displaced people. And it was during that time that I met a young Afghan family, 5 children, including 1 infant, and they were scared and huddled together, shivering from the cold. And they were living in basically a dugout hole, covered by nothing more than a roof of twigs and leaves. And, that look in their eyes, that hollowness, that feeling that perhaps we've reached the end of the line will never leave me. So their parents were gone, killed by the Taliban. And, the girl that was actually looking after this family was Yusra, the oldest sibling, couldn't have been more than 13 years old. She was looking after this entire family. And I noticed as we spoke to her, she was kind of nodding off from the sheer exhaustion. And on the siblings, we also saw frostbite sores from the exposure at night. Now, since then, I've been to other conflict zones around the world. And what you notice is that a lot of children don't have the privilege of experiencing that innocent childhood that we may have had. It's as if all of a sudden they're catapulted immediately into adulthood. And then you can see that, again, that look in their eyes of what they're experiencing. And you see a lot of kids looking after kids. Now, at that time, between Afghanistan and Tajikistan border, I was working for UNICEF, United Nations Children's Fund. Any talk or thought of immediate resettlement of this family was out of the question. Those types of decisions, of course, further up the food chain among officials in Islamabad and New York and Kabul and Washington. And what happened next was my niece and nephew had heard about this family. They had seen my photographs and they had read the stories that I had written. And they immediately mobilized to take all of their winter clothing in Canada, ship it over to me, and then I would help them distribute it to this family. You can see the box there. And you can imagine how immensely we felt as a family privileged to help this family, and also the relief on their faces as they got this winter clothing. Since then, lucky or not, I've worked in about 20 different countries around the world. Most of them happen to be on that list, Fragile State Index. And, it's given me quite a bit of insight over the years, and I'd like to share with you some of the root causes of what prompts people like that Afghan family to move, to uproot themselves, and what you can do to make a difference. And I really want you to know that no matter how small your contribution, it can make a real impact. I also want you to know that there are real attainable and useful moves to make a positive difference. And nowadays, it can be outside those large bureaucratic structures like the UN and like NGOs. And I really want to wake you up to the fact that, the world is becoming such an unpredictable and complex place that outside the box thinking, new approaches are what's going to be needed for us to be able to start turning back the clock on things like climate change, the migrant crisis, and hopelessness. Now, since I've encountered that family on the Afghan border, I've worked in many different places where I've met people on the move, including in Pakistan, in Myanmar, the Gaza Strip, Luhansk and Donetsk in Ukraine, and also the Turkish-Iraqi border. And there are basically 3 factors that cause people to move. One is conflict and wars. Number 2, famine in the environment. And then hopelessness. What I wanted to do is to take a little bit of a pause. And, it's very easy for some of the names and faces of stories of these people on the move to get lost. And among the Syrian refugees right now, there are about 2 million children, and I wanted to show you one of their stories right now, please.
جاي لاجئة سورية نطلع على ألمانيا مشان نخلص من عذابنا نحن نخلص من ألمنا نخلص من الظلم من الذل اللي كنا عايشينه حاج بقى بكفي ألم كل شي تغير ما بقى في شي مثل ما كان أبدا حاجتنا عذاب بس حدا يفهمنا حدا يساعدنا
Enough pain. Enough pain. Right now, as we speak, there are about 1.5 billion people, including about 350 million of the world's extreme poor, who live in an environment of continuous fragility, violence, and conflict. And right now, we're seeing one of the largest human migrations since the end of World War II, and there are going to be millions and millions more behind them if things continue the way they are. Of course, when we talk about conflict and war, as we stand here in Poland, we don't have to look very far at all. Over the past 2 years, over your border with Ukraine, a conflict has been raging for about 2 years now between Ukrainian government forces and also very, very heavily armed rebels in the east. And things are not getting better. In that time, the conflict has claimed the lives of thousands of people, and also it's displaced about 2 million people altogether, perhaps 3 million. Of course, on the other side of the Black Sea, we have Turkey, which is currently playing host to about 2 to 3 million Syrian refugees. And, you know, it does strike me, as having worked in these different organizations, that by now one would have expected that the diplomatic process or those diplomatic efforts would have kicked in a lot more. But they haven't. And it does strike me that it's now time for us to see more new blood and new into the decision-making process, perhaps even make more room for the private sector to play a bigger role there. Let's move on to famine and the environment. So among those push factors that I talked about are also bad weather, climate change. And right now, as we speak, in Ethiopia, it's experiencing one of the worst droughts in the past 50 years. And that drought is getting so bad that now experts are telling us that we can not only expect about 2 million cases of malnutrition over the next year, we can also expect to see a lot more people on the move, and that the devastation could rival the 1984 famine, which claimed the lives of 1 million people. Now, what is especially depressing here, too, is that over the past few years, Ethiopia has been a star economy on the eastern coast of Africa. And of course, the last thing we'd want to see is another Live Aid for Ethiopia. Then we have hopelessness. And you know, when we talk about hopelessness in this world, we're often tempted to talk about Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. But now, more and more, because of growing populations and because of climate change, we should also be looking at places like Lagos, the most populous city on the African continent. And I want you to have a look at, by way of illustration, this email I received just a couple of days ago from a friend in Lagos, fashion designer, and you can see what they're going through right now. No electricity, no gas, hottest weather in years, and guess what? I'm looking for a way out of this country. And as much as the optimist I like to be, things look very worrisome on the African continent, and it isn't only because of the climate change, it's also because of stubbornly high birth rates. Some experts are now predicting that the population in Africa could jump by 2100 to 6 billion, up from the over 1 billion at the moment. Now, of course, there's no easy answer to these types of problems of population growth, especially when birth rates remain stubbornly high. But I wanted to tell you that one of what I've seen time after time after time, what makes a big, big difference is empowerment of women, especially adolescent women, girls' education. And I would strongly encourage you to investigate which organizations support girls' education. Now, one of my favorite is the Nike Foundation, and the theory they have is something I very much agree with. If you put just a little bit of investment into an adolescent girl, educate her, provide her with some funding for small business, it could make a huge difference, and it has a very knock-on effect. And not only that, we're finding that if we put adolescent women in big numbers back into the workforces, they could add actually trillions and trillions of dollars into their respective economies. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Nike Foundation. They were, of course, started by the good people in Portland, Oregon, who make the Nike shoe. Well, it turns out that they've not only been making shoes, they've also been developing very innovative models to help empower women on the African continent. I visited one of their projects in Bujumbura in Burundi. And what they've done with great success is that they've helped these girls start micro projects, or with microfinancing, they start their own businesses. And then what happens? They feel more empowered. They feel more confident. And guess what? Early marriage is delayed. Early pregnancy is delayed. So it's a win-win situation all around. So again, I do strongly encourage you to investigate these types of organizations. And I also would like to let you in on a little secret. It shouldn't leave this room. New cutting-edge research out of Stanford University in California tells us that by doing good, by leading a life of purpose, well, it can actually help your career. I encourage you to research that further, and I encourage you to, do the research and follow your heart and your mind, and it could help you in your career. We talked a lot earlier about social media and how it can have an impact, actually, how it can really distract us, but it can also do good. And at the moment, I'd like you to think about this young Google executive, Wael Ghonim, who kickstarted Egypt's democratic revolution. And he did so after becoming completely disgusted by photographs of Khalid Said being tortured and beaten up by the Egyptian police, you can see there. And what Ghonim taught us was that the power of the people is often stronger than the people in power. I also want to encourage all of you to, in the path of doing good, also to think about your own humanitarian efforts. Now, I talked about that effort we did in 2001 to help that Afghan family. Call it a small-scale humanitarian effort, if you will. Well, you too can also do your own small-scale humanitarian efforts. There are, aside from Facebook and Twitter, we have disruptive technology now. Kickstarter. Kickstarter has worked to help thousands of families and individuals around the world, including in Africa. And for example, it's helped to breathe new life into the chocolate-producing industry in places like Ghana. And of course, you can also work more independently. This young lady, Katie from Australia, during her MBA program in the United Kingdom, she visited Tanzania, and she realized that people were actually dying in their own homes from fumes and from fires from kerosene, because they used kerosene to light their homes. And she thought, there's got to be a way to develop clean, safe technology to save these families from killing themselves. So she developed a very affordable and attainable system of solar panels, and now they're being used by thousands and thousands of people in Tanzania. You know, I'm often asked about what it's like to be in this sphere, how to be, you know, what's it like to be a spokesperson. And I've always told myself the saddest thing that could happen are basically two things. That I would become immune to those hollow, lonely faces of the children that I meet every day when I'm working in the field, like the children you saw in those photographs. And I also said to myself, the worst thing that could ever happen if the world's gaze is averted, that no one pays attention anymore to the conflicts, and especially to the children that are suffering in many of these conflicts. It so happens that in many of the countries around the world where conflict is raging, especially in the North Africa and Middle East, children constitute 50% of the population. So the suffering is immense, and you wonder how these children will grow up. Now, in closing, I'd like you to think of Yusra, the young girl I talked about earlier on in Afghanistan on the border. She was caring for 5 of her siblings at the age of 13. The next time you tell yourself, I'm too tired, or I have no time to do good, to volunteer, to research solutions to certain problems, well, think of her. She wasn't too tired, and she took on that responsibility. I know one thing is her memory is what powers me on day after day after day, not only to talk about these issues, but also to do good in the world. And I hope you'll join me. Thank you.